Evelyn leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the flickering light above. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee, and the rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock filled the silence. She had always loved the quiet moments at home, the small sanctuary where the world couldn't reach her. But tonight, the quiet felt heavy. The sound of the front door opening jolted her from her thoughts. Her father stepped inside, his presence larger than life as always, though he looked thinner, wearier. His once meticulously combed hair was slightly disheveled, and his shirt clung awkwardly to his frame, as if it had been hastily tucked in. "Evelyn?" he said, his voice smooth yet laced with an undertone she couldn't quite place. "I need your help." Her brows knitted. Help? It wasn't a word her father often used. No, he was the kind of man who always had answers, not questions. "With what?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She kept her tone neutral, but her stomach tensed. He placed a small, leather-bound book on the counter between them. It looked old, the edges frayed, and there was an almost eerie aura about it. "I need you to go through this. Help me decode it." Evelyn blinked. "Decode it?" She chuckled nervously, unsure if he was serious. "What is this? Some kind of treasure map?" Her father didn't smile. Instead, he leaned closer, his eyes locking with hers. "You're good with languages, Evie. I remember all those competitions you aced in college. This is similar. Just give it a look." Tonight, there was something unspoken in his tone. Urgent, unyielding. She glanced down at the book, brushing her fingers over the worn cover. Her instinct whispered to refuse, to walk away, but the way he looked at her, pleading yet firm, made her hesitate. "Dad, what's this about?" she asked cautiously. "Why is this so important?" He straightened, his jaw tightening. "It's a matter of life and death." A chill ran down her spine at the gravity of his words. Her father, the unshakable pillar of their family, had never been the melodramatic type. If he said it was life and death, she had no reason to doubt him. But what could a worn-out book possibly have to do with that? She opened it. The pages were filled with symbols and phrases in a language she didn't recognize. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Latin? Some obscure dialect? She turned the pages, her curiosity battling her unease. "This doesn't look like anything I've seen before," she muttered. Her father's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with startling force. "You can't refuse me, Evelyn." His words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the room seemed to grow colder. For a moment, it felt as if the walls were closing in. She stared at him, wide-eyed, as an unsettling pressure crept into her chest. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "Dad, you're scaring me," she whispered. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, releasing her arm. "Just don't stop. Don't look away." As he stepped back, his shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long across the room. Evelyn clutched the book tightly, her pulse racing. Whatever this was, it was no innocent puzzle. Her father wasn't telling her everything, and she couldn't shake the feeling that opening the book was the first step into something far darker than she could comprehend. Evelyn sat at her desk, the ancient book before her, its presence almost magnetic. Her father had gone upstairs, leaving her alone with it. The house, usually comforting in its familiarity, now felt oppressive. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall echoed like a countdown. She ran her fingers over the first page where a symbol, a circle split by jagged lines, stood boldly in the center. Beneath it were words written in a language she couldn't place, their sharp angles and curves stirring an odd sense of déjà vu. Had she seen this somewhere before? She thought back to her college studies, to the shelves of books she had devoured, but nothing came to mind. As she turned the page, she found more of the strange script interspersed with rough sketches. Some were diagrams, others illustrations of figures? No, creatures. Their elongated limbs and hollow eyes made her stomach twist. Pattern of picking. "What are you hiding, Dad?" she murmured under her breath. The faint creak of a floorboard startled her, and she glanced over her shoulder. Nothing, just the empty hallway. Shaking her head, she refocused on the book, determined to prove to herself that there was nothing to fear. Hours passed as she worked, taking notes and cross-referencing the symbols with what little she could find online. Frustration gnawed at her. Nothing matched. It was as if the language had been pulled from a void, untouched by history or scholars. Then, at the bottom of one page, she noticed a set of numbers. Coordinates? They were scrawled hastily, as though added long after the book had been written. Evelyn grabbed her phone and plugged them into a map app. The location was in the middle of nowhere, an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of the city. Her father's voice broke the silence. "How's it going?" Evelyn nearly jumped out of her chair, slamming the book shut. "You scared me. Did you find anything?" he asked, stepping into the room. His face was shadowed, unreadable. Your Honor, you wrecked the port and damaged bits and pieces," she lied. She wasn't ready to share the coordinates. Not yet. Her father's intensity unsettled her, and she had learned long ago to tread carefully when he was like this. His gaze lingered on her, and for a moment she thought he might press her, but then he simply nodded. "Good. Keep going, and remember what I said. Don't stop." Evelyn waited until he left before she reopened the book. Something about this wasn't just unsettling. It was wrong. Her father wasn't just being secretive. He was hiding something dangerous. A part of her wanted to leave the book and never look back. But another part, the part that had always been curious to a fault, refused to let go. Unwilling to sit in silence any longer, she grabbed her keys and jacket. If her father had trusted her to decode this, he wouldn't suspect her of leaving. But she had to know what was out there. The coordinates burned in her mind, a beacon she couldn't ignore. As she stepped into the crisp night air, she glanced back at the house. A shadow moved in the upstairs window. Her father's silhouette, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned quickly and climbed into her car, the engine roaring to life. Evelyn had no idea what she was walking into, but every instinct told her there was no turning back now. Evelyn awoke with a jolt, her head slumped against the desk. She had dozed off while poring over the book, but the room felt different now. Her desk lamp flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. She glanced at her clock. It was 3:12 a.m. The book lay open to a page she didn't remember turning to. Unlike the previous ones, this page was blank except for a single bold symbol in the center. A circle broken by jagged lines. As she stared at it, her vision seemed to blur, the lines appearing to move. She shut the book abruptly, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone and texted her father. "What is this book really about?" No response. Her unease grew as the house creaked around her. The silence felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Suddenly, a faint sound broke through the stillness. Soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a window. Evelyn froze. Her room was on the second floor. The tapping grew louder, insistent. Her pulse quickened as she slowly approached the window, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the glass, her breath fogged it as she peered out into the darkness. Nothing. No one. But as she turned away, she saw it, a faint outline in the reflection of the glass. A figure stood behind her, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows of her room. Evelyn spun around, heart in her throat. But the room was empty. "Dad?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She hurried downstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath her bare feet. The door to her father's study was ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling into the hallway. She pushed it open and found him seated at his desk, hunched over, the book's duplicate open in front of him. "Dad, what's going on? I saw something." He looked up, his face pale and his eyes rimmed with dark circles. "You opened it, didn't you?" Evelyn faltered. "What do you mean, the book?" His voice was barely a whisper. "It's not just a book. It's a key. And now they know." A sharp knock echoed through the house, louder and more forceful than before. Her father stood abruptly, grabbing her arm. "Evelyn, listen to me. Whatever happens next, don't let them take you." "Who's them?" she demanded, but he didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the door. The knocking grew louder, shaking the walls. The shadow from the book's illustration crept into her memory. Evelyn realized, with dawning horror, that her father's request had unlocked something far worse than she could have imagined. The knocking turned into a deafening pounding, reverberating through the house like a heartbeat. Evelyn's father yanked her toward the study's corner, his grip tight and unrelenting. His eyes darted wildly between the door and the floorboards, as if expecting the house itself to collapse. "They hear," he muttered, almost to himself. Evelyn struggled to pull her arm free. "Who's they? What's happening?" Before he could answer, the pounding stopped, leaving an unnatural silence that felt more suffocating than the noise. Evelyn's father froze, his shoulders stiffening. "Don't move," he whispered. The air grew dense, and Evelyn's skin prickled with static. She barely dared to breathe as she glanced toward the study door, now ajar and creaking ever so slightly as if pushed by an unseen hand. A faint, cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it a low, guttural hum that resonated deep within her chest. Her father reached into a drawer and pulled out a small vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her palm. "What is this?" Evelyn hissed, her panic growing with each passing second. "It's protection, if they touch you." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Just trust me." Before she could ask more, the light in the room flickered violently and then died, plunging them into darkness. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the faint hum grew louder, transforming into an almost melodic, inhuman whisper. It wasn't coming from outside the door. It was inside the room. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't speak," he said sharply. A shadow shifted near the desk, darker than the rest of the room. Evelyn squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes forming before her. It wasn't just one shadow. It was multiple figures, their outlines indistinct, their movements unnervingly fluid. Her father stepped in front of her, his voice steady despite the fear etched across his face. "She isn't yours," he said firmly, addressing the figures. The shadows stopped moving. For a moment the room was silent again. Then a voice emerged, not a single voice, but a chorus of overlapping tones, both male and female, high and low, young and old. "She opened the book," the voices said in unison. "She is ours now." "No," her father barked. He grabbed the book from the desk and held it up. "You have what you want. Leave her out of this." The figures surged forward, faster than Evelyn thought possible. Her father pushed her back as they enveloped him, their dark forms writhing like smoke. He screamed, a sound so raw and visceral it made her knees buckle. "Run!" he shouted through gritted teeth. Tears streamed down her face as she hesitated, paralyzed by fear. But when her father turned toward her, his face already half consumed by the darkness, she knew she had no choice. "Evelyn, go!" She stumbled out of the study, her father's screams following her as the house seemed to twist and shift around her. Every shadow she passed felt alive, reaching, pulling. She clutched the vial tightly, her mind racing with questions and terror as she ran toward the front door. Whatever her father had gotten her into, it wasn't over. Not even close. Evelyn burst through the front door, her bare feet hitting the cold, wet pavement outside. The night was unnaturally still, the air heavy with an oppressive silence that made her ears ring. She clutched the vial her father had given her, its strange warmth a stark contrast to the chill biting at her skin. Behind her, the house groaned as if alive, the walls trembling under an unseen force. Shadows leaked from every window and crevice, spilling out onto the lawn like a black mist. She backed away, her breath visible in the cold night air. Her heart hammered in her chest as her father's anguished cries echoed faintly from within. "Dad!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the night. The shadows didn't stop. They crept closer, serpentine and deliberate, stretching unnaturally across the ground toward her. The darkness shimmered, forming vague shapes, hands, faces, eyes. Evelyn stumbled backward, the vial slipping in her sweaty grip. Suddenly, a voice pierced the silence, low and resonant, like 1,000 whispers layered together. It was the same voice she'd heard in the study. "You cannot run from us, Evelyn. The key has been turned. The door is open." She shuddered, gripping the vial tighter. Her father's words replayed in her mind. "It's protection." But protection from what? What could possibly stop this encroaching void? The figures from the shadows began to emerge, their forms shifting and unstable. Their hollow eyes locked onto her, empty yet filled with malice. Evelyn's mind raced. She couldn't outrun them. Her father's screams were gone now, leaving an unbearable silence. Desperation clawed at her, and instinct took over. She unscrewed the vial's lid, the thick liquid inside glowing faintly. It pulsed in her hand, as if alive. Without thinking, she flung it at the nearest shadow. The liquid erupted in a flash of light, brighter than the sun. The shadow recoiled with an unearthly shriek, its form dissolving into mist. The other shadows hesitated, their movements uncertain. Evelyn didn't wait. She grabbed the book from under her arm, opened it, and began tearing the pages. Each rip sent out a ripple of energy, the shadows writhing in agony with every page she destroyed. The final page burst into flames as she tore it free, and the shadows screamed as they collapsed into nothingness. The silence returned. Evelyn stood trembling, her breath ragged, surrounded by ash and faint embers. The house behind her was still, eerily quiet. But her father was gone, and the world, she realized, would never feel the same again.